Good morning. Today we'll start with a new poet from our paper 8C, Unit 4, that is Emily Dickinson. To start with the poems, first we'll discuss Emily Dickinson as a poet. So, Emily Dickinson has the distinction of being the greatest women poet of America. She lived a retired, secluded life, yet she wrote great poetry. She is regarded as one of the greatest poets of all times and perhaps the greatest of all women poets. Her contribution to the American poetry is remarkable and it has left an impact on the American poetic scene. The major themes, if we discuss, of Emily Dickinson chronologically belongs to the 19th century, but in their style and form, her poems have close affinities with the 20th century. Means she was much modern in her outlook towards life. She wrote her poems as she lived her life. Her universe or her surroundings was that of the soul. Her special task was to make the universe articulate. Nature was her close and loving friend. Her religion was a broad concept. She didn't or she doesn't talk about church or the fanatic form of the religion. She could converse directly with her God. Death was always present in her poetry. In short, she mused on the mystery of life and death, on the nature of the human soul and immortality with rare insight and penetration. As a lyric poet, the bulk of Emily's poetry consists of lyrics. Most of them are very great short lyrics. The intensity of her own vision imparts intensity to her lyrics. Due to the perfect unity of vision and expression, she is considered to be a great lyric poet. Number of her lyrics have dealt with nature or the scenery or the subject matter of almost of all of her lyrics was nature. Her lyrics were like battlegrounds for the clash of opposites. They have dealt with her fearless and heroic acceptance of life. Here we'll discuss here we'll talk about one of her nature lyric. Quote, there is a certain slant of light on winter afternoons that oppresses like the weight of cathedral tunes. Treatment of nature, how she has dealt with nature in her poetry. As a nature poet, Emily did not follow the Wordsworthian concept of nature or the tradition that Wordsworth had given in poetry. That was of nature worship. In her poetry, nature had a separate identity. Her treatment of nature is original and of her own. She has not copied anyone in talking about nature. Emily is as much alive to the mystery of nature as to her beauty. The beauty of nature is minutely and felt and observed and rendered precisely. The poet has composed many nature lyrics and they have dealt with all possible subjects or objects, forces, and phenomena of nature. For her, nature and God were like two unknowable entities which were beyond the range of human comprehension. In one of her beautiful poems, she says, quote, we spy the forests and the hills, the tents to nature's show, mistake the outside for the real, and mention what we saw. Unquote. Emily was also a great love poet who has some personal experiences of love in her own life, her love poetry may be divided into three major groups. The first group expresses the poet's love, devotion, and the staunch loyalty to her absent lover. The second group may be called the poems of separation and consequent suffering. And the third group, the poems are of renunciation. So, it shows that the poet has written about her own personal experiences of love, where she was purely in love with someone or was missing someone, or the separation and the suffering of love can be seen in her poems. In some of her love poems, Emily seeks to make light of her suffering. In such poems, she writes of love with the mocking wit of the metaphysicals and with their conceits. Here we can see in the following lines how she compares her life to a loaded gun. Quote, "My life had stood a loaded gun in corners till a day. The owners passed, identified, and carried me away." Unquote. Some of other poems in which Emily has employed sexual imagery too with very amazing candor. Her love poems can be interpreted both as an expression of profane love and even love for God. In short, we can say that Emily has played all possible notes in the orchestra of love. Emily as a mystic poet. So, Emily was also a great mystical poet. Like all mystics, she deals with God, death, soul, and immortality. She speaks of the divine love in terms of sexual love. She believes that the entire universe overflows with divine love and beauty. For Emily, divine love is the culmination of all spiritual attainment, and marriage with Christ is the only means of attaining eternity and immortality. In this manner, she was a path breaker to talk about the divine with sexual overtones. To attain spiritual immortality, death is essential. It is the gateway to immortality. The poetic style of Emily was like that she was more interested in the content than the form and structure of the poem. Her poems are extremely compressed. Economy, conciseness, and simplicity are the important parts of her poetic style. Her technique of writing poetry is typically American. Her English was not that like bookish English, but it was her own native speech. She is famous for her cryptic sentences, and her understanding of the meaning of words was subtle and complex. Her images were drawn from everyday life. She is, though criticized for her weak craftsmanship and for the violation of the rules of grammar, but in spite of all these shortcomings, her poems have a great charm. So therefore, we can say that Emily Dickinson is really a genius and a typical American poet. Her poetry has vast range. Her contribution to the world literature is remarkable, and she is considered to be the best woman poet of the world and is remembered still as a major American poet. Thank you. We'll discuss other aspects of Emily Dickinson as a poet, her themes of her poems, and various poems in detail in our next lecture.